Have you ever wondered why some people seem to be able to read your mind when you're competing in a TCG tournament? Well, stick around because today we're going to be exploring the subtle art of bluffing and reading to give you that advantage in TCG tournaments. As many of you know, I went to the Galactic Championship in Vegas for Star Wars Unlimited recently, and I'm very excited to announce a special event that I'm running with my local game store, Comics, Games and Coffee Chichester, where we are putting on a special Chaos draft. Here we'll be drafting with 1 pack of Shadows, 1 pack of Twilight, and a pack of Legends of the Force, and there's some extra special prizing up from grabs straight from the Galactic Championship. So if you turn up to the event, you'll at least walk away with a pin from the pin passport, and then if you finish in the top 5, you'll be able to choose from 1 of 5 special prizes, including a Vader and Grand Inquisitor soft crate, a Metal Initiative and Shield token, or 1 of 3 cards which include the Poe Dameron from the Black Packs, the Shin Hati from the prize wall, and also a Count Dooku Judge card. Now, I'll make sure to leave a link in the description below, and I hope to see you there. Today we are going to be talking about this concept of bluffing and reading your opponent in TCGs, and we're going to start off with focusing on this concept of bluffing. Now, in TCGs, there is certain information that is required to be open to both players at all time, and this can vary from game to game, but typically it will include things like what's on your board, what's in your discard pile, and either one of you are able to look through those sections of the play area at any point. Now, the hidden information, which typically includes things like what's in your hand, your resource pile, etc., this is going to be the area where you're going to be conducting that bluffing. Now, when it comes to bluffing, what we want to be able to do is create this false narrative in what we might have in these hidden areas of our hands. We're not required to disclose what's in our hand, but there's certain actions and techniques that we can use to make our opponent think along certain lines and lead them into thinking in certain ways on what we might have in our hand. When it comes to delivering a bluff within TCGs, there are certain considerations that we need to make. The first one being plausibility. Now, this is going to be impacted by probably the matchup that you're playing within. You know, what are the typical lines of play that your deck will be trying to run against that particular deck, so that you can try and bluff with your opponent. If you're trying to bluff with a card that you wouldn't necessarily use in that matchup, then it's going to be less believable for your opponent in that situation. So we need to think about, is our opponent going to believe that we have this card in our hand? And that's going to also be impacted by things like how many resources you have open, etc. So you need to think about all the small details that might go into the bluff. They might play based on how many resources you have open. So you need to make sure that things like that match up with the card that you are trying to bluff with. The next is the timing of the bluff. We don't want to be trying to bluff every single turn because then that's going to impact the effectiveness on it. We need to bluff at the key moments in the game, so at pivotal points, to make sure that the bluff is most effective and also lines up with the bluff that you're trying to pull off. Finally, you also need to consider that this is a risk versus reward situation. Just because you're trying to pull off this bluff doesn't mean it's going to necessarily work. If you do pull it off, it's probably going to be very beneficial for you, but also there's that chance that it doesn't come off and you're wasting your turns of play on something that's not going to come to fruition. Now, when it comes to pulling off a bluff, this is where the psychology of our body movements really comes into play. So think about when you're playing against an opponent, if they're drawing their cards for the turn and are looking at their hand in disgust or in excitement, we're probably going to be able to infer from that some different things based on how they react, and that's where we're utilizing those psychological skills to understand what our opponent might be trying to do in those situations. But there are those times when we're playing against those top players that it becomes a lot harder to actually read what they're drawing, because you see them draw their cards and you don't get any information from them from those moments because they're calm and they're composed and it's hard to see what they're drawing. So we can use those subtleties when we're trying to pull off a bluff in order to lead our opponent into thinking in certain directions. So for instance, when you're drawing those cards, even if you don't have the card that you need, you might give off a subtle smile to show that, oh, actually this is what I need for this moment. Or the way that you're setting up for your turn, you can act in a confident and composed way, and that's also going to send messages to our opponent in these situations as well. Again, we want to use bluffs sparingly and at the right time, so you need to think about when it's going to be most effective to pull this off, but think about how you are going to actually portray that in your body language as you lead into that bluff. When it comes to reading our opponents in TCGs, we can also utilize this information to pull off a convincing bluff as well. So keep this information in mind as you're planning out how to effectively bluff as well. So we want to read our opponent to be able to identify when they might be trying to bluff themselves, and also to try and fill in that gaps in the hidden information based on what they might have in hand, etc. So first of all, we'll be looking for changes in speed of play. So you may have noticed previously in games where you're getting to a critical moment of the match and your opponent starts to play their lines a little bit faster, and they seem to have just sped up that little bit towards these key moments of the game, and that might hint to us that they believe they have the cards in hand to finish off the game. So based on that information, we can reflect on what deck they're using and what their typical lines of play might be, to try and figure out what cards that they have in hand that we then need to play around for those final few rounds of the game. In a similar manner, you may have been in situations where your opponent starts to hesitate in the way that they're playing, and that might indicate to us that they have a suboptimal hand for the situation. And we can often take other information from these situations as well. So for example, when a player hesitates, I will typically see them go to pay a resource cost and then change their mind as they think through that decision a little bit longer. And we can actually look at how many resources they were going to play in that situation to be able to try and determine what cards they might have in their hand based on the cost of those cards. There are also other situations where your opponent might not use all of their resources in one go, and they might pay like 5 of 7 resources, for instance, to play a card. And you think, well, that's strange. Why wouldn't they play a 7 cost unit in this situation, or a 7 cost card? And they're purposefully leaving those 2 resources open. Again, we can utilize that information to try and figure out what else they might be trying to achieve in that turn. Of course, there are some situations where there's not necessarily any other option but for them to play those cards. But again, we're trying to figure out those subtleties in the changes of movement and the way that they're playing to figure out if it's intentional or not, and again, if they're trying to bluff with us or not. There are also physical tells that we can look out for, and these can often be quite subtle, but can give us some good information if we're able to read them correctly. So for instance, changes in body language can be a good initial place to get started. So for instance, at the start of the turn, if they're drawing their cards and you notice them lean in just slightly into their cards, that might indicate to you that they have the cards that they need, or they drew the cards that they need in that situation. If they start to fidget with what's around them, this might indicate to you that they don't have the optimal play in their hands. So we might take that body language change as information to guide us on what plays that we're going to make. You may also look at your opponent's eyes, and I'm not just saying stare into their eyes as they're playing, but look at where they're focusing in on the board state. What areas of the board are they looking at? And that might tell you again, maybe they have removal cards that they're trying to target specific units you have on board, for instance. You might be able to gauge that information based on where their eyes are looking as they're drawing the cards at the start of the turn. And finally, you may also notice that your opponent shuffles the cards in their hands as they draw. Now, this is a deliberate tactic to try and dissuade you from seeing where they're placing the cards that they just drew in their hand, often used against decks that might have hand removal. As we're thinking about reading our opponent's plays, it's also important to remember that it's not always information that we can utilize. For instance, it might just be an opponent being nervous in this situation, and those changes in body language might not necessarily mean anything at all. So combine the information that you're observing with what you know about your opponent and the current board state to try and determine if it's actually going to be useful for you, or if it's just your opponent being nervous in that situation. Thank you so much again for joining me today as we talked about more psychological skills in TCGs. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and comment below what is the best bluff you've ever pulled off in your TCG tournament career. If you would like to share this video with anyone, I would more than appreciate that. And I hope to see you all on Monday the 1st of September. at CGC Chichester, where we'll be holding the Chaos Draft event for those Galactic Championship goodies. Until next time, make sure you win that mind game meta.